Hi there, how you doing? Good evening. If you go visit Jerusalem today, you can go to Via Dolorosa, which is a very popular pilgrimage site because Via Dolorosa marks all the stations. Okay, so as I was saying, take two. At the end of Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, which marks all the stations that are said to be part of the Passion of Jesus, you wind up at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And if you go inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and you go to the altar, which is the most elaborately and ornate part of the church, that is the spot that is said to be where Jesus was crucified at Calvary or Golgotha, and you can actually look and see the ground. A few steps away from that is the stone of anointing where Jesus' body was prepared for burial in the sepulchre. And then in the church, now underneath this structure, is the sepulchre itself, a cave where Jesus was buried. And this is the spot where the site of the resurrection occurred that is described at the end of Matthew and the end of Mark. The story goes something like this. Mary Magdalene, or Mary and a group of women, depending upon which version you're looking at, goes to the sepulchre and discovers that the body of Jesus is missing. So Mary immediately goes to the apostles go to the sepulchre, and indeed the body is missing. And then Jesus appears before them and says, "Meet me at a mountain in Galilee." So the apostles meet Jesus at a mountain in Galilee. And it's a very quick moment, but as Jesus is about to ascend up into heaven, Jesus says to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel for all the nations." That's the version at the end of Mark chapter 16. Matthew chapter 28 is a little different. It is, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." These words and these expressions are what inspired my discussion tonight, Go and Preach. And Go and Preach is the theme of Spiritist Week. And this moment in the Bible is part of what's called the Great Commission in Christianity. And the Great Commission in Christianity is to do ministry, missionary work, evangelization, and baptism. So in a way, Go and Preach means go and administer churches locally, or go and do charity, or go and teach, or go and convert. But what else does the word preach mean? Well, according to Webster, it means to deliver a sermon. Pretty straightforward. I think most people imagine somebody standing up and delivering some kind of wisdom. But to go a little further, the second definition is to urge acceptance or abandonment of an idea. So obviously the meaning of preach is to try to persuade people towards a certain point of view. But preach also has some kind of pejorative meanings. For example, preach can mean to exhort in an officious or tiresome manner. Officious means to be kind of meddling, even irritating. To exhort would be, somebody standing up in front of people and going, "You're either going to convert to Jesus or you're going to burn in hell," that kind of thing. And you got to shake your fist and you got to raise your voice and get really upset. And that's all very well and good, but this tends to turn people off a little bit and make people run the other way. The word preachify means to preach ineptly or tediously. That's pretty straightforward. And preachy is marked by obvious moral excitation. So again, trying a little too hard to make a moral point. When you describe, for instance, movies or plays as being preachy, that's not a compliment. But there's more to what go and preach means than its mere definition. So what I'm going to do is try to stretch that meaning out just a little bit to strongly suggest that go and preach certainly implies action, and it implies behavior. But before we get there, why did Jesus rise from the dead, appear before the apostles, and more or less tell them to go and preach? Didn't he do that already? Don't the apostles know that they need to do this? Well, let's put it this way. Jesus didn't want to leave anything to chance. And yet, why did he need to say to them, go and preach? Well, during the resurrection, after Mary Magdalene discovers the body's missing and goes to the apostles, not all of them believe her. They're skeptical. And this is a rather common theme in all four Gospels. The apostles often struggle with faith. They have a lack of faith at times. Sometimes they just don't understand what Jesus is really trying to say to them. And so struggling with faith is part of what the apostles are struggling with in the Gospels as a whole. And one example of this is the story of the boy who was an epileptic. This is in the Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 19. The chapter happens to be called Faith Moves Mountains. It's the story of a boy who's an epileptic, and his father goes to Jesus and says, could you please cure my son? I went to your apostles, your disciples, and none of them could do anything. And Jesus, this is one of those moments where Jesus gets a little testy, slightly impatient, and he says, in effect, O unbelieving and perverse generation, how long will I remain with you? So Jesus is implying there's only so much time left. When are you guys going to finally be able to do this for yourselves? And then he says, okay, bring the boy to me. And Jesus is able to cure the boy. He removes the spirit. So you could say it's a type of spiritual healing, as it were. And the boy's fine. Now the apostles are a little embarrassed about this, and they go to Jesus privately and they say to him, why couldn't we cure the boy? And Jesus says, because you don't have faith. You have so little faith. And then comes the famous quote, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move, and nothing will be impossible to you. So Jesus is emphasizing the importance to have faith, and I would say that that's part of the point of go and preach at the end of Matthew chapter 28 and Mark 16, where he's saying, yes, go and preach, but also go and have faith, because that's what's going to drive most everything else that they do. The Gospel, according to Spiritism in chapter 19, makes some important points about faith. First of all, faith has to be calm. Faith has to be, we have to have confidence and in our own faith. Not only do we need to have confidence, but we also, when we have confidence, we're able to handle or move the mountains, as it were. And the gospel talks about mountains a little more metaphorically. It's talking more about the inner mountains that we have within us. For example, our prejudices, the ways in which we rebel, the ways in which we have fear. What about the mountain of being stubborn, or the mountain of thinking that we know everything when we don't, or the mountain of getting stuck in a routine and so forth. But the inner mountains is really more the point rather than the literal mountain of trying to move a literal mountain. And this seems to be what Jesus was really aiming at. And chapter 19 of the Gospel according to Spiritism does emphasize that faith is calm, that faith is confident because it's supported by reason. We all know that Spiritism is a reasoned faith, And it takes time to really understand Spiritism, but as we ask lots of questions and try to explore why we think why things are the way they appear to be, then we can begin to develop a reasoned understanding of things, which then in turn develops our faith. At the same time, a wavering faith almost instinctively senses its own weakness. And when we have a wavering faith, sometimes that can lead to us feeling a little bit hostile or even angry, in part because we may be driven a little bit too much by some kind of personal interest or selfish agenda. I'm going to speculate that maybe, just maybe, when the apostles tried to cure that boy who was an epileptic and they couldn't, maybe one of the reasons they couldn't is because they were trying to show off a little bit. I mean, these guys were fishermen. They came from simple backgrounds, and now they're with this really charismatic guy named Jesus. And he's healing people right and left, so they want to be able to heal someone. So perhaps almost out of a bit of desperation, maybe a desire to show off, it's like, heal, and it doesn't work, because they didn't really have internalized what it means to have faith. But having confidence does not mean we should be arrogant. Having confidence means we need to be meek. And so part of having faith is having the right balance between confidence, being calm, yet being humble at the same time. And all of that is really key as a combination. And when we have faith, when we have genuine faith that's really driven by love, this is what allows us, genuine faith, we sort of have our trust, we turn our trust over into God. And if we have love in our hearts and we're very sincere, then we're able to perhaps heal. Part of spiritual healing, for instance, is, yes, you got to learn some techniques, but really you need to have the right intention to begin with. And then you can begin to help others. There's a really nice quote from Joseph, and this is again in chapter 19 of Gospel According to Spiritism, in which he says that if souls can be convinced that they have this force that I was just describing within, and if they really want to place their will at the service of this force, in other words, we give ourselves over to God, we therefore connect to divine will, as it were. If we can do that, then we can do, as he puts it, the so-called miracles that are described in the Bible. Maybe not literally per se, but nevertheless, we have more strength than we might think we do. And a few other things about faith: it really can't be dictated, and it can't be imposed, because if you try to impose faith, well, that's encouraging blind faith. And a lot of times when people are encouraged to have some kind of blind faith, there comes a point where they're going to rebel or they get turned off. But it's kind of like this. Having faith is something that we do look for. It doesn't go looking for us. And it's kind of like this. The kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is like a state of being in which, once we've gone through various trials and have overcome various obstacles, we can then begin to connect to where the kingdom of God is. The kingdom of God is not like some fisherman with a net trying to swoop down and grab us out of the ocean. So God is not actively trying to snatch us away from things. Yeah, God may intervene at times, but the point is this: we need to really do the work ourselves. Through the trials that we go through the various struggles that we go through, we begin to develop a faith that's more genuine. And it's a little bit like we're almost hardwired for faith. Sometimes when people struggle a lot with faith, it's because they want to believe, but they can't, but something's preventing them. And other people just seem to have faith kind of naturally. Well, chances are they have that natural faith because they went through a lot of struggles in previous incarnations that sort of prepared them for the current life, where they seem to almost click, as it were, and begin to develop a faith. And the gospel according to Spiritism does make the point. It's not like the apostles didn't have faith. And when I was talking about them struggling with faith before, I wasn't suggesting that they don't. In fact, in Acts chapter 3, the very beginning of chapter 3, Simon, Peter, and John are about to go into a temple. And there is a lame person, somebody who can't walk, who's asking for alms, for money. And Simon Peter says to him, I have no silver nor gold, but I will give you what I have. In the name of Jesus, walk. And he grabs the guy and he picks him up, and the guy's able to stand. And this person who's about 40 or so, this person who could not walk, goes into the temple with Peter and John. And he's thrilled. He's almost jumping for joy, as it were, because suddenly he's able to walk. And this, of course, gets a lot of attention from people in the temple, not to mention the attention of the religious leaders, which is one of the things that got Simon, Peter, and John into a lot of trouble later on. But this kind of faith, again, they had developed their faith by this point. When Jesus was saying to them, go and have faith, in some ways he was saying to the apostles, look, you guys have got to take the next step. I'll even go so far as to say he was kind of telling them, you got to grow up a little bit. You've got to develop your own spirituality. And Acts is one of those parts of the Bible that demonstrate that that began to happen, which is touched upon in the Gospel according to Spiritism in chapter 19, where, again, the apostles did indeed develop their own faith. There's also a nice comment in chapter 19 of the Gospel according to Spiritism about faith, which is that to be worthwhile, faith must be constantly active and never dulled by inaction. So faith, like love, like a relationship that we're in, it requires work sometimes. And we have to, yes, we can have our faith, but sometimes we get hit with all kinds of challenges, all kinds of trials that may make us think twice about the faith that we have, and that can be a struggle. So when we do more active work in some way, that can help us to maintain our faith and even deepen it. And if we don't do this, we may wind up a little bit like the fig tree, which is also talked about in chapter 19 of the Gospel. The fig tree has a lot of meanings, but basically it's based on the idea of, you can tell how good a tree is by the kind of fruit that it produces. And the dried fig tree can represent inaction, of someone preaching who does it very charismatically and has a lot to, it's a lot of presence, but when you listen to what they're saying, there really isn't much to what they're saying. So the dried fig tree is, again, not really putting our faith into practice in a very effective way. Go and preach also has a very important part of it, in that go and preach, I mentioned before, is about action. It's about behavior. And so a great way to do go and preach is to lead by example. Now, there have been many Christians who have done this. They led by example. But one of the best and most exemplified of them all is Francis of Assisi. And I'm going to spend pretty much the rest of this lecture talking about Francis. Francis has received all kinds of accolades. Sometimes he's been called the last Christian or the greatest Christian. And even if that's not entirely fair, because there are a lot of great Christians that we have as examples, what Francis tried to do was that he really tried to exemplify Jesus Christ to the best of his ability. And that was part of what made him such a phenomenal Christian. Francis is well known for having founded the Order of the Friars Minor, which got started in about 1208. And by 1209, or 1210 technically, Francis visits Pope Innocent III in Italy and receives his blessing, and that's when the order really gets established. I'm going to take just a little moment here and do a quick promotion. Next Sunday at the Mount Vernon Spiritist Center, Sunday, September 22nd at 4:30. Spiritist group Love and Light will be doing the play that is done before about the life of Francis. But what it's going to focus on primarily is the relationship between Francis and Pope Innocent III. So this is happening at 4:30, Mount Vernon, New York. At 3 o'clock, I believe, Zaida Villarraga is going to be speaking then. So if you go, you can go to both events, really. So I hope all of you will be there. And yours truly has been roped into this thing to do some music stuff. So I'm going to focus on Francis a little differently. One of the things about Francis is that Francis was really not interested in rebelling against the church. He was not interested in trying to start something new. He was not criticizing the church. So he wasn't one of these people wagging his finger all the time at the problems of the church. Rather, what Francis accomplished was to reinvigorate the church by reminding the church and people what the real priorities of Christianity are. So Francis very much supported the institution of the church, and this is a very important point to understand about Francis. There's a Spiritist book called Love Exists Among Us by Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro, and he writes about several people who had great missions, and one of them was a chapter that he does on Francis. And a couple of things he says about Francis is that he said Francis was much loved by Spiritists because he's considered, many Spiritists, according to him, regard Francis as one of Jesus's greatest messengers, and that he was sent to earth to really advance humanity. Obviously, someone who had a very important mission. He also says that Francis came to, quote, put love at the heart of religion and feelings above political or social issues. And the point about political and social issues is important because Francis was born in the medieval period. Roughly that starts around 800s and goes to about 1300s. So Francis is in the medieval period. And what was the medieval period like? Well, a couple quick points. The church was very, very powerful. The church had turned into a large and very powerful institution. So much so that sometimes the church was fighting against the crown in Italy at that time. Italy was not a unified country. It was made up of different little fiefdoms, as it were. And the church was often struggling over control over society. In this time period that Francis lived in, 90% of the people were involved in agriculture in some way. And also money was starting to get introduced as a form of currency and as something that had value. Land was very important during this period, but you can only hold so much land in your hands, but money you could really hold in your hands. And sometimes that brings out all kinds of strange feelings in people. And yet, part of the attitude of this time was that people would look at these coins or this thing called money and kind of go, so what? You know, so people sometimes had some difficulty sort of comprehending what the value of money was all about. Francis's first biographer was a guy named Thomas of Solano. And he wrote a book about Francis in 1228. Francis was born about 1182, probably, and died in 1226. So only 2 years after Francis passed away, he was about to become or be declared a saint. And this happened because of Pope Gregory IX. Pope Gregory IX succeeded Pope Innocent III. And Gregory was a fellow friar with Francis at one time. And so he was a friend of Francis. And he wanted to build a church in Assisi that would be the burial place for Francis. And he also wanted to see a biography written about Francis. And Thomas of Solano was a good choice for that because he was very educated. He really knew his theology. In fact, the way a lot of this first life of Francis is written it's full of references to the Bible as it talks about Francis. And there are certain editions you can have where it cites every single reference to the Bible as you go through the text. Thomas of Solano also did another work a few years later. This was about 1245 or so, and it was called The Remembrance of the Desire of the Soul. So he did two works on Francis, and then he did some shorter works. And I'm mentioning this because this work by Thomas of Solano was really the foundation of a lot of what came later in terms of the literature that there is about Francis, and there's a lot. I mentioned before in the Gospel According to Spiritism that sometimes people are kind of hardwired for faith, and Francis was certainly someone who was like that. But if you know anything about the early life of Francis, his conversion, which didn't happen overnight, it happened over a period of time, given his early life, his conversion was nothing short of miraculous. Francis, again, was born in 1182, and he was the son of a rich cloth merchant named Pietro de Benefori. And Pietro de Benefori was in a profession that was rare for that time. You remember I mentioned only 90% of people were involved in agriculture. But he was prospering rather well selling cloth. And Thomas of Solano, in talking about Francis's early life, doesn't have too many great things to say. He said that his parents reared him in accordance with the vanity of the age. And that implied that basically children of the well-to-do were, quote, slaves of sin, and that they tended to display nothing of the Christian religion. Rather, they were called Christian, but they didn't really have the Christian religion within them. And this was part of that era where there were a lot of people who were just sort of going through the motions and showing up at the right time, but their hearts really weren't in it. Thomas of Solano says a few other things about Francis that are not exactly compliments. He tended to describe that Francis was a little frivolous and self-indulgent. Remember, Thomas was a friend of Francis. But it's safe to say that this is probably how Francis saw himself looking back on his early days, because he was not ashamed to be brutally honest with himself about his own flaws. And so, yes, Francis was frivolous, self-indulgent, and so forth. Francis, to put it this way, Francis as a young man was a party animal. He liked to drink, he liked to go out with his friends, he liked to make merry, he liked to go out and sing and be like a troubadour and all this stuff. And Francis had one thing in common with St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, who lived about 8 centuries before him, in that they both had a tendency to sort of exaggerate their deeds, you know, show off in front of your friends, oh yeah, I did such and such, and things like that. But, and Francis was also a bit of a practical joker. This was the first 23 years of his life. Francis is described as having squandered his property. It's safe to say he squandered his time. He was 23 years old, and this is how he was, more or less. And you got to remember, back in this era, people didn't live very long. 40 would be very old, so he's already 23. Many people passed away in their 20s at this time. But all of this was about to change. It started in the year 1202. Francis is probably about 20 or so. And Francis gets involved in this local war between the city of Assisi and Apia. And these two cities are fighting each other, and Francis gets involved in this. And he gets caught by the other side, and he's a prisoner of war for about a year. And apparently, while he was a prisoner of war, he was a pretty easygoing guy about it. But he's a prisoner of war for about a year, and then he comes back to Assisi, he's released, and he gets really, really ill. And while he's ill, he does recover, but as he's in the process of recovering, Francis is starting to kind of look at life a little differently. He looks at how beautiful the countryside of Assisi is, things like that, and he kind of goes, what's the point of it all? You could say that Francis probably went into a state of depression at this point, because he was beginning to sort of question what everything was. He was sort of questioning materialism at this point, even if he didn't fully understand what that meant. But he was kind of lost during this period. And Francis also was most certainly a medium. In 1205, he's about 23 or so at this point, Francis hasn't quite figured out what he wants to do, but he did decide at 23 that he wants to be a knight. He's going to go off and get involved in another war, and he's going to have glory and honor and all the stuff that was common of the age. So Francis joins the papal forces against a local king. Remember, I mentioned that the church and the crown were often fighting each other. So Francis joins the papal forces. And he's in an area called Spoleto, and he's sort of gearing up to be involved in this war. And then he goes to sleep and he has a dream or a vision. And he sees all of this military equipment, arms, and all that stuff. And then a voice comes to him. And the voice says to him, "Who can do more for you, the servant or the Lord?" And Francis answers, "The Lord." And then he asks, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" Kind of like Paul of Tarsus running, when he encounters Jesus, he says, "What do you want me to do?" He suddenly gets a shock, as it were. And the answer is, "Go back to the land of your birth, because I will fulfill your dream in a spiritual way." Thomas of Solano puts it this way. Francis didn't really understand exactly what this message meant. He was given a bit of a hint, but he really had no idea what was going to come next. And Francis, nevertheless, started to feel more invigorated. The way Thomas of Solano puts it is that Francis wanted to really serve God. He became anxious to serve God. And Thomas of Solano puts it that he was turning his fleshy weapons into spiritual ones. So Francis goes back to Assisi, and he starts to spend more time in solitude. He has a close friend, and he starts talking to his friend about heavenly treasure and stuff about God. And they would sometimes go to a cave, and his friend would wait outside the cave, and Francis would go in, and he would actually try to have a conversation with God. So he spent a lot of time really meditating and trying to connect and understand what this message that he received was all about. So he starts going through that kind of period. Meanwhile, he began to start trading clothes with the poor. This image, by the way, is from the movie Brother, Sun, Sister Moon. I had that up there before. Brother, Sun, Sister Moon was a movie made by Franco Zeffirelli. This was made in 1972, the early 70s. Zeffirelli is most known for movies like Romeo and Juliet and The Merchant of Venice and so forth. And this movie is not, it takes some liberties with history. It's not historically accurate, but it tries to capture some of the spirit of what Francis was struggling with. And part of what Francis was struggling with is he was saying things like, money doesn't make you happy. Having wealth doesn't make you happy. And yeah, this movie made in 1972 is, it's a comment about the counterculture. And there are times in there when Francis looks a little bit like a hippie and stuff like that. But the movie is trying to capture one aspect of Francis in which he was questioning what happens when you're overly attached to materialism, which of course is a core teaching in Spiritism. We don't say materialism is bad, per se, but we do try to be very mindful about being overly attached to materialism because it can cause a lot of problems. It can be a big inner mountain, which I mentioned before. So Francis started to trade places with the poor. This scene is him going down below his house where his family is, and these are all the people that work for him. And he looks at how miserable they are and how exploited they are. He is the son of a wealthy merchant. He's supposed to inherit all this, And the people who work for his family are virtual slaves. And this really bothers him. Now, this didn't happen in real life as far as we know, but what did happen was that Francis went to Rome around this time when he was about 23. And Francis goes with a friend to a church, and there's poor people outside the church. And what Francis does is that he sits down with the poor and he joins them. He starts eating with them and he starts begging for alms with them. And his friend is watching this and he's kind of embarrassed and wishes Francis would get up and they could go do something else. And chances are, if Francis were left to his own devices, he probably would have done even more of this. But his friend, got him to curb his enthusiasm a little bit. So what happened is that Francis starts interacting more with the poor. And the way Thomas of Solano put it was, he hadn't quite joined them, but he was wanting to be like them in his heart. So Francis is in a transitionary period. And another way in which this comes out is his relationship with lepers. He will be known for helping lepers and taking care of them. But Thomas of Solano, in writing about Francis, again, he was a friend of Francis, so he's a primary historic source. He said that Francis had a natural horror of lepers. It was said that apparently if Francis was within 2 miles of some lepers, he would hold his nose because of the stench and the smell. So Francis didn't really want to be around lepers. And yet there was a story where Francis is riding his horse on an open road one day, and he sees a leper. And he gets off his horse and he goes to the leper and he gives this leper some money. And then he does something else. He actually takes the leper's hand and he kisses it. And then he gets back on his horse, and as he's riding away, he turns back and looks at the horse for the leper, and the leper's not there. Thomas of Solano suggested that Christ came to Francis as a leper. Perhaps. But whatever it was, Francis was trying to confront that part of himself that he had the most fears about. He was working on his inner mountains, as it were. And at this point, Francis's conversion was well underway. There's the next big moment in Francis's life. One day, Francis has some cloth of his father's, and he goes to a nearby town to sell the cloth. It's red cloth. And he sells it, and he rode there on his horse. So he sells the cloth, he gets the money, and he also sells his horse. So he then has to walk back from this town all the way back to Assisi. And while he's on his way back, he's near the gates of Assisi, the city of Assisi, and Francis comes across a vacated church, San Damiano. And this church has been abandoned. And Francis did what he was often doing at this phase of his life. He would go in to pray. He wanted to pray in this church. And the crucifix of Jesus was still hanging in this church. So Francis goes to pray. And Thomas of Solano says that Francis, in effect, got another voice or another message from Jesus, which basically went something like this: Francis, go rebuild my house. As you can see, it is being destroyed. Thomas of Solano said basically that Jesus spoke through the wood of the crucifix, and it was a new kind of miracle. But Francis took this literally. He thought, okay, I need to rebuild this church. That's what that meant. So I'm going to rebuild this church stone by stone. So he starts to do this. And then Francis, as he's doing this, well, he needs some money to do this and so forth. Well, guess what? Francis starts using his father's money to rebuild the church. And eventually his father finds out about this, and Dad is not very happy that his son is spending his money on this crazy scheme of his. So Francis is out at San Damiano working on the church, and he starts to hear that his father's really, really angry at him. And Francis decides that maybe if he hides for a while, the anger will subside. So he finds a pit nearby and lowers himself in the ground, it sounds from what we know, and he stays there for a month. And he rarely comes out of that pit for a month, except maybe occasionally for bodily needs, but not necessarily that even. So you can imagine how unpleasant and uncomfortable that was. But Francis was putting himself in physical discomfort. And while he was there, you got to wonder, what was he doing with his time? Well, he was probably praying and meditating a lot on what he's really going to do next. And one of the things he must have thought about is, I have to go confront my father. So after a month, and he was also probably thinking about where his life was going to go at this point. And maybe he was waiting for more messages from God. I mentioned he was a medium. So Francis comes out of this pit, and he goes back into town of Assisi. And he's really, really happy. He's elated. He feels more spiritually free at this point because he's made some decisions about what he's doing. And people think he's a lunatic, and they laugh at him and they mock him and they throw stuff at him. And of course there's a lot of gossiping because it's a small town after all. And Francis's father hears about this and hears that his son has showed up again. And his father finds Francis and beats the living daylights out of him. And then he takes Francis and he locks him up in chains in his house. Now, if parents did that to their kids today, they would go to jail. The good old days. You know. I'm kidding. So Francis is locked up in his house, and Francis's mother doesn't like this very much. So when his father goes away on business, which he did a lot, Francis's mother frees Francis, and Francis goes right back to doing the work at San Damiano. Well, once Dad comes back, Dad hears that son got released, and Dad is not very happy. He's trying to control Francis, and he can't. And he's kind of a guy who has a lot of pride. And people are saying things about Francis, and that has to be embarrassing. He's a guy who's got a position in this town after all. He's a rich cloth merchant. So he finds Francis, and he takes him in front of the bishop of Assisi. And he wants the bishop to do something about this rebellious, unruly kid of his, who's 23. And the bishop, but Francis makes it clear that Francis is trying to serve God, and he really means it at this point. And the bishop sees that, and the bishop doesn't want to get involved in punishing Francis, but he does talk to him. And it's clear that Francis can't be using his father's money to be rebuilding this church. So then comes a moment which we're told was not something that Francis planned, but it's a moment that maybe you've heard about. Francis in the town square with his father before the bishop and in front of people who are watching, Francis takes off all of his clothes. He strips completely naked, and he takes his clothes and he hands them to his father. And the message is, I don't want to owe you anything else. I don't want to feel like I owe you or I'm attached to you in any way. And so what Francis is doing is he's made a choice. He's made the choice to give up the comfortable lifestyle that he came from. He's made the choice to give up his biological family in favor of his spiritual family. So his conversion is now complete, and he realizes that he's going to embrace poverty, and he's not going to turn back. So it's a very dramatic moment. And the bishop, seeing this naked guy out in the open, puts his cloak around Francis, and they take him into the church for a little bit. But then soon after that, Francis is on his way. And you can imagine how painful that must have been for his parents. I mean, they don't really understand what's going on with him. And some people think he's crazy. But people also notice that Francis is very happy. And there's something going on with him that he is very much at peace. And that is what people start to notice about him, is that there's something infectious about this happiness that Francis feels. This way, he says it meant that Francis was trying to inspire in Christ's followers that everyone who lives in simplicity, that they're loving by serving those who cannot yet serve. So he was by choosing poverty as a lifestyle, he wasn't necessarily saying wealth is bad, but he did think that wealth ought to be shared. And Francis understood that what he was doing wasn't for everybody. This was the choice he made for himself. But he was also trying to set himself as an example by becoming a beggar and by becoming somebody who really had nothing. So this was one of the ways in which he was trying to emulate Christ, who we're told had absolutely nothing, owned nothing. Well, Francis would go on to rebuild San Damiano, and he rebuilt some other churches. San Damiano, by the way, would be the future home of Clare of Assisi. I don't have time to talk about Clare, but she too was a great Christian in her own right. She founded an order kind of like the Brothers Friar for women. And she's also was revered as a saint. And this was an early home where Clare of Assisi was. And she established her order with the help of Francis. Francis was a few years older than she was, and he helped her to get established. So Francis was trying to, again, embrace radical poverty. And in 1208, that's the time when he started to get inspired to develop what would become the Order of the Brothers Friar. And this happened in 1208 when Francis was at a feast of St. Matthias. St. Matthias was the apostle who replaced Judas after Judas hanged himself after betraying Jesus. And so he's at this feast celebrating this apostle, and Francis hears a quote from Matthew chapter 10. And the quote is Jesus talking to his apostles, and in effect this is advice from Jesus to his apostles on how to go and preach. And what Jesus says is, take no gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, no tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it, and stay with him until you depart. So Francis, this idea of taking nothing with you, he really took that literally. That to him was the point, was to really own nothing. And you would travel light and you would travel simply. And Jesus goes on to say, and if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that town. Now in the Gospel according to Spiritism, it talks about this passage. And the Gospel emphasizes that as a practical matter, traveling alone and having any money on you at all during this time period, time of Jesus, or even during the time of Francis, traveling on the open road was pretty dangerous, and people were likely to get robbed. In fact, soon after Francis converted and left Assisi, he did get beaten up by some people. So, and he handled it pretty well. But these guys were engaging in activity that could put them at risk. So there was the practical matter about that, but also it's a matter of a spiritual awareness in terms of releasing oneself from material stuff like money and so forth, and keeping things as simple as possible. And Jesus also, and the other point that the gospel makes is that if you're trying to talk to somebody and persuade them, in this case, to follow God, if they really don't want to listen to you, then respect that and move on. In other words, as I was saying before when talking about the negative meanings of the word preach, don't push people too much. Because sometimes, you know, there are branches of Christianity that do that. And a lot of times this turns people off. So Jesus was saying, focus your energies and your time on those who are receptive to you in the first place. And if they don't want to listen to you, maybe later on down the line, but they're obviously not ready now. So if I think Spiritism is the greatest thing since sliced bread and I want to go out and tell everybody about it, well, if I run into people who maybe don't get it or don't really want to listen, fine. It's not up to me to convince them. And that's the point that the gospel according to Spiritism is making and talking about this. But also Jesus said, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So put another way, Jesus is saying, be kind, be open, but don't be naive. Francis and his brothers were putting themselves in danger sometimes. Sometimes they got mocked. Sometimes people harassed them, and so forth. Other times they were well received. So it was, you never knew exactly what was going to happen to you. So they obviously had to be careful. I'm going to go back real quick. Just another point. During this period that the Brothers Friar was starting to develop, these guys were pretty hard on themselves. They would put themselves in physical difficulty just by the lifestyle they chose, but sometimes they took it pretty far in terms of things like if they had thoughts that they were not proud of, maybe sexual thoughts or something like that, if it was winter, they would literally go out and roll in the snow or immerse themselves in cold water and things like that. And the idea was to try to really confront their parts of themselves that they felt they had to overcome. And so these guys were not afraid to do what was uncomfortable. Francis, for instance, might go begging for alms with people that used to know him when he was a happy-go-lucky rich guy, and here he is dressed in rags begging for money. Well, they probably made fun of him. And at first Francis felt embarrassed about that, but then he would stop himself and go, nope, nope, I'm going back there, I'm going to confront this. And then he would go back and confront it. And then the more he did that, the more his faith deepened because he was putting his faith into action, and the more he became more comfortable with the fundamental choices that he was making. So by 1209, Francis feels he's ready to go to try and have a meeting with the Pope. The Pope. It's like one of us trying to meet with the President of the United States. So it's difficult, but Francis makes the effort with his brothers. By this time, Francis happens to have 12 followers. He was developing a following bit by bit. As I mentioned before, his happiness was infectious. And people saw that, and they began to wonder, this guy's up, he's tapped into something. So he has 12 followers in 1209, and they go to Rome. And they try to meet with Pope Innocent III. And there were some pragmatic reasons for this, because Pope Innocent III was not exactly the most innocent. Pope Innocent III burned some people for heresy. They burned them at the stake. So there was the danger of being labeled a heretic in this time period, and Francis had some legitimate concerns about that, and he was probably advised that they'd better get the Pope's blessing. But also Francis really wanted to know that what he was doing was right, and that he was in harmony with the church. As I mentioned before, he was not trying to break off from the church. So he wanted to know that what he was doing was okay. So he goes to the Pope, and at first the Pope is hesitant about meeting this guy, but finally the Pope does so. And by 1210, in April of 1210, the Pope recognizes and gives his blessing to the Order of the Brothers. Back then it was called Order of the Brothers Minor, but then it eventually became Order of the Brothers Friar. Or I'm sorry, Order of the Friars Minor. My apologies. These are a couple of images from the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. And I have this up here because there's a couple of interesting things. Francis, in the movie, they go into this ornate looking church. And there's the clergy, who are all nicely dressed. One thing I didn't mention before in talking about the medieval period is that pretty much all of the clergy of the church came from the nobility. The reason, well, there's two reasons. First of all, because they practiced celibacy, they always needed new people. And second, the church was very powerful, and if you're, say, the second son or the third son, you can't inherit the land. That goes to the firstborn. So if you're the second-born or the third-born, you got to figure out what you're going to do. And joining the church and getting involved in the clergy was not a bad move at all, because you would have a lot of power and prestige. But that doesn't mean that the clergy was necessarily made up of a lot of people who really had Christianity in their hearts. Some did, but some didn't. And so it was a mixed bag. And when in the movie, when Francis and his followers, his 12 brothers, 12 apostles as it were, go into the church, they're dressed in rags, they're dirty, they look very humble, and they are there with these well-dressed looking clergy, and there's the Pope who looks like the king and so forth, and they're all like, who are these people, you know, how can we trust them and so forth. And it's a little bit like Jesus and the apostles say walking into the second temple in front of the Pharisees who don't trust them at all, that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of that in the movie. And as I mentioned before, by the way, the Pope was played by Alex Guinness, who was Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, for what that's worth. The movie takes some historic liberties because at the climax of this movie is that the Pope is moved by what Francis is doing after Francis and his brothers are literally run out of the church, and the Pope has a change of heart. And the Pope not only embraces Francis and talks about that he obviously understands what it means to be a Christian, but the Pope actually gets down and kisses his Francis' feet. Well, we know that didn't happen. There was no historic mention of that. But the movie ends that way with the climax. So it's the Pope demonstrating humility because the Pope understands that Francis understands and that Francis really got what it meant to be like Jesus and to really follow the teachings of Jesus. I'm going to start to wrap up here. There's a quote from the Gospel according to Spiritism, again, that kind of captures, I think, what Francis was about, which is simply teach through the example of your faith and you will infect everyone. Teach through the example of your works and you will demonstrate the merit of faith. Teach through an unshakable hope and everyone will see the courage that empowers you to brave even the hardest of life's challenges. So again, one way to not only deepen our faith is to demonstrate. People could stand up and say words and they may be meaningful, but when we actually go out and do things like this, that's when we're really inspiring. And in the book Love Exists Among Us, he says that Francis was a bridge between heaven and earth. And the way he puts it is, and I like this, divine thought was able to materialize and be understood through him. So Francis had a deepened faith, and with a genuine faith, then divine will was able to work its way through him. And likewise, anyone who had an affinity with his principles could also imitate him. Francis wrote a little bit. There are some writings of his that survived, and one was a letter to the order of the entire order of the Brothers Friars Minor, I mean. And one of the things he emphasizes is that it's really only through the Spirit that we can connect with God, and that the Spirit is the one who makes the Word of God come alive. And this is in harmony with what Spiritism says. In question 11 of the Spirit's book, it points out that humans see and understand God when their minds are no longer obscured by matter, and when they have come closer by striving for perfection. So Francis is saying that we have to try to go a little bit beyond the confines and the restrictions of the body and rely more upon the Spirit. Or I'll put it to you this way. Spiritism emphasizes strongly about needing to develop the Spirit, and develop our spiritual growth. And the more we do that, the more it actually allows us to connect to God. And so in a way, not in a way, I would say the most important aspect of Go and Preach would be that we need to do our best to try to connect to and comprehend God and the real purpose. And that's the real purpose of Go and Preach. Thank you.
minutes if anybody has any question to hear, comments about the lecture. Just feel free to make a comment. Don't be shy.
I could pick on somebody if you like. Yes. Yeah.
I love the lecture.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
But I want to know where did you take beautiful pictures? Every picture looks like an art book.
Uh-huh. God bless the internet. There's thousands of pictures, well, not thousands, but there's lots of stuff out there. So for better or worse, one of the things I do sometimes in preparing PowerPoints is I comb through the internet to see what's out there, and I say, oh, I like this and I like that. And, you know, some of this stuff probably is hanging in a museum somewhere. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You mentioned that he was in India. Through your research, where are the examples of his leadership?
Well, they're the ones that I mentioned about receiving voices. Anytime that he felt like he was having a vision or receiving a message from God. So two of the more well-known examples, I didn't research all of them or anything like that, but again, just to repeat, in building San Damiano, he got a message, he got a voice. And was he an abstensive medium? Probably. But he heard the voice and felt that's what he had to do. And again, the other one was when he was preparing to go to war, joining the papal forces against the king, and he was in the area of Spoleto. And he was while he was dreaming that he saw, for instance, the armor and the things of war. It's probably safe to say he had an out-of-body experience and that he went out of his body. And I don't know how much information there really is about that, but there's probably more that one can cite. Yeah, there's like a whole section called the Miracles of Francis. Unfortunately, my time was limited, so I couldn't do everything exhaustively. But, I should emphasize that one can't possibly say everything there is to say about Francis in one sitting by a long shot. There's so much more that was accomplished.
Did he finish the church?
What's that?
He did finish build the church?
Yeah, he finished San Damiano and then he rebuilt a couple of others as well. That was sort of the... no, he did it by begging, by getting support. You know, mainly begging. You know, he didn't go to after he left his father, he never went back to his family. In the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, there's a scene, again, we don't know if it's true or not, but he's in the town of Assisi with his brothers and they're begging, and he stops by his house and he goes in and he sees his parents like up on the second floor, and he can see how alone they are and how quiet it is. And he just can't bring himself to go any further, so he walks back out. So did Francis have moments where he may have felt that temptation? Probably. I think, again, maybe not historically accurate, that movie, but I think it was trying to be emotionally accurate.
It's amazing how he had that moment of solitude, just like Paul.
Yes.
After he gets the call on the way to Damascus, Paul spends years, right?
Yes.
In the desert as a weaver.
Right.
He spends a month in the hole.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's somebody who's really serious about, I mean, just imagine what that was like. How do you sleep, you know? So, did you have a?
Is there any historical indication of when he realized that rebuilding the church was not actually rebuilding the physical church, but the institution of Christianity?
The moment with San Damiano probably happened in about 1205. So he was about 23, and he left his father soon after that, so like within a few weeks maybe at best. So most of this was in the year 1205 or thereafter. And then there's a passage in Thomas of Solano that talks about like living stones. So somewhere in the process of literally rebuilding the church, he starts, when he started attracting followers, I think at that point he began to realize that maybe there's more to what I'm doing here than just that. So it certainly happened by the time the order of the Friars Minor was established, which was in about 1208. So probably between 1205 to 1208 was that transitionary period where he began to realize, okay, I don't need to keep building churches for the rest of my life. And he may have also gotten more voices, as it were, because part of what it's been put this way, sometimes if we are receiving a call and we get a little bit of information for now, and we start to be active, and then more information comes later. We get maybe more messages in some way. Maybe if we're mediums or more attuned, we may get overt messages, or our intuition is strongly telling us this is the direction I should really be going in at this point. But it's not like the message is all laid out. Well, first you're going to go and rebuild churches for a couple of years, and then you're going to, from that point, you're going to develop a following, and then you're going to go visit the Pope and so forth. It happened organically. So, Okay? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
I was thinking how when a person has a mission like that, how lonely it also can be.
Very.
Right? I don't know if you guys have been following, but I've been following that girl. I forgot her last name. Greta.
Oh, the environmentalist, 16 years old. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And at 16, she's also going through that she sees the bigger picture, and she feels so alone because nobody else feels like nobody else can
Right.
see it.
What's her name?
Yeah. She is here now in this country. I don't know if she left yet. Yeah.
Yeah. And she's also, she has Asperger's. She has Asperger's. Yeah.
Asperger's. Yes, I knew that she had an affliction.
Superpower because he helps her focus on
Right.
what she's. But
Yeah.
it came to my mind because she also had that defiant moment with her father, where she had a speech prepared, and when he read it, he thought it was too much. So he got really angry, and he's like, "No, you cannot say that. It's too much."
Mm-hmm.
So she erased it from the speech and memorized it. And when she
And then did it anyway.
She
Yeah.
did it
Yeah.
anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
So she's obviously an example of someone who's driven and has a mission. Apparently, as I understand it, she started hearing about global warming and the environment when she was 8. So she clued in really early. She's one of those people, apparently, it looks like so far, who knew early on the direction she's going to go in, and who knows what's going to happen over time. But to zeroed in that early on something like this, and to be as public as she is, you're right, it is lonely. Because how easy is it to have friendships? I mean, she's a teenager. Teenagers don't want to be, I mean, a lot of teenagers often feel lonely, but having a social network is important at that age. And she's probably got a lot of people who admire her, but the more well-known she gets, it's like the more you have barriers with people, whether you want to or not. It's hard not to.
Because it shows the faith, the power of the faith. Like you mentioned,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It was very resonated.
Yeah, and it sounds like she has an unshakable faith so far from what we've seen, you know. And again, so much of having faith is you have no idea what's coming down the road, but you have faith and you just kind of go, and then things start to reveal themselves to you, and you begin to see, hopefully at some point you'll see more clearly what choices you should be making or what choices to avoid. And that's part of what faith is about. Alrighty. Well, thank you very much.
Couldn't think of a nicer